Journey with us to Northeast Africa as it existed 14,000 years ago, when it was dominated by a vast landscape where human ingenuity was tested against the extremes of nature. Here, in an ancient world far different from our own, diverse populations carved out their existence across a dramatic spectrum of environments from scorching deserts to grasslands. In this harsh but dynamic landscape, survival demanded adaptation. Our ancestors clustered in the life-giving Ethiopian highlands and along the vital arteries of the White and Blue Nile. Beyond these havens, the land stretched empty and forbidding. Waterless expanses east and west of the great rivers lay largely untouched by human footprints. Yet it was here, in this unforgiving landscape, that humanity wrote one of its most remarkable chapters, a story preserved not in stone or clay, but in our very essence, our genes and our languages. Deep within the genetic code of modern humans lies an extraordinary mutation known as PN2. Like a thread woven through time, this genetic signature creates a tapestry of human connections spanning continents. It belongs to Y chromosome haplogroup E. Think of a haplogroup as a genetic surname passed down through time, creating a living record of ancient migrations and connections. The story told by haplogroup E is astounding in its scope. It accounts for nearly 3/4 of all genetic variation in Africa, reaching beyond the continent's borders into the Levant and southern Europe. Its presence outside Africa reveals a profound truth that human connections emerged relatively recently in human history, likely after the last ice age, shattering old notions of separate races. But how did this genetic signature spread across such vast distances? Scientists propose two intriguing possibilities. Either the PN2 mutation emerged before the birth of distinct language families, laying the biological foundation for these groups. Or maybe it appeared through extensive interaction and intermarriage among the speakers of these early, ancestral language families after they had already started to diverge. The genetic evidence points to an origin in the Horn of Africa and Sudan, the same crucible where two major African language families first emerged, the Afroasiatic and Nilo-Saharan languages. Like branches of an ancient tree, the Afroasiatic language family spread its roots across the land, splitting into 6 distinct groups. In the Ethiopian heartland, Cushitic and Omotic languages took hold, with Cushitic speakers venturing beyond into neighboring territories. Along the lower Nile Valley, the now extinct Egyptian language once echoed through temple corridors and village streets, while Berber, also known as Amharic, and Chadic languages found their home to the west of the life-giving Nile. And in the distant lands of Western Asia emerged the Semitic languages. Like parallel streams flowing through time, the spread of Afroasiatic speakers closely mirrors the journey of the M215 subclade of PN2. Born in the Red Sea hills of Sudan and Eritrea some 22,400 years ago, this genetic marker traced ancient migration routes from the Nile Valley, across northwest Africa, through the Levant, and finally to the shores of the Aegean. Remarkably, these ancient migration routes closely matched the wide distribution of Afroasiatic languages we see today, a testament to how our ancestors carried both their genes and their languages across the continent. The second branch of this genetic story, the M2 subclade, tells a tale of connections predominantly across sub-Saharan Africa, with its influence reaching into North Africa and the Middle East. Its parent subclade, EV38, emerged in East Africa but reached its peak in West Africa, gradually diminishing as it spread east and north across the continent. Today, the presence of EM2 is mainly associated with Niger Congo-speaking populations and is often linked to the Bantu migrations that spread across much of sub-Saharan Africa around 4,000 years ago, largely replacing the ancient A and B haplogroups that had dominated these regions. Haplogroup A is considered a basal lineage, meaning it represents some of the earliest branches of the human Y chromosome tree, and is predominantly found in Africa among people of African descent. Today we find the highest frequencies of haplogroup A among the Mbuti Pygmies and Khoisan peoples of southern Africa and among Nilo-Saharan speaking populations of East Africa, particularly among Nilotic pastoralists. These Nilotic speakers are part of a larger Eastern Sudanic branch of the Nilo-Saharan language family, which includes Nubian and covers a vast territory from southern Egypt to northern Tanzania. At the heart of these ancient connections stands the Horn of Africa, a crossroads of humanity where genetics reveals an intricate web of migrations, not only outward, but also back into Africa, long before recorded history. Here, in the very landscape where our genetic journey began, The echoes of these ancient connections still resonate today. One of the most intriguing discoveries is the identification of a distinct genetic component in the Horn of Africa, known as Ethio-Somali. This component has its highest frequencies among Cushitic and Semitic-speaking populations in the Horn of Africa today, particularly among Somali and Ethiopian Somali populations, where it constitutes the majority of their genetic makeup. Like a time capsule preserved in our genes, this component tells us of a split that occurred over 23,000 years ago, separating it from populations in North Africa, the Levant, and Arabia. The Ethio-Somali population then developed in relative isolation, maintaining a genetic identity distinct from populations outside of the Horn. But the story doesn't end there. This Ethio-Somali component has a genetic cousin, the Maghribi component, which would eventually become the dominant genetic signature across North Africa, particularly associated with a culture known as Iberomaurusian. Deep in a cave near Tafrilt, Morocco, archaeologists have unearthed human remains from this culture dating back 15,000 to 14,000 years ago. The male specimens share a common ancestor with modern Ethiopian, Somali, and Berber, or Amazigh populations, and a specific subgroup of Natufian and pre-pottery Neolithic cultures in the Levant. Some scholars propose that a population with substantial Ethio-Somali ancestry may have been the original Afroasiatic speakers. The Afroasiatic language family is believed to have originated either in the Levant or in Northeast Africa. The most recent and supported theory for an Afroasiatic homeland is the central Nile Valley and the African Red Sea Hills area, proposed by linguist Christopher Ehret, a prominent researcher in this field. The African origin theory has gained widespread support among scholars. The African branches show considerably more diversity than the Semitic branch, indicating that the African branches have had far more time to evolve and diverge than their Semitic cousins. In contrast, the Semitic languages share a relatively high degree of similarity, hinting at a more recent and rapid expansion outside of Africa. The geography of the successive branches of the Afroasiatic tree suggests that the family originated somewhere in the Horn of Africa, and that speakers of the languages of the family then spread in a step-by-step succession of advances outward from the Horn. According to Ehret, the Proto-Afroasiatic language initially diverged into two daughter languages, one ancestral to the Omotic branch and the other to the rest of the family, which he calls Erithraic. The Erithraic branch then diverged into two, with one branch being the Cushitic branch, which continued to be spoken in regions in and around the Horn of Africa. Some linguists believe that Chadic was the initial branch to diverge from Proto-Afroasiatic in the Nile region before migrating westward to the Chad Basin. Chadic languages exhibit the highest level of diversity among Afroasiatic languages. This significant diversity has prompted some researchers to propose that Chadic could represent the oldest branch of the Afroasiatic family, suggesting a lengthy period of development. Much later, the Erithraic branch produced an offshoot that became the ancestor of Egyptian, Berber, and Semitic languages. The earliest Semitic speakers, or perhaps the Proto-Semito-Berber speaking communities, appear to be connected to the Natufian culture in the Near East. These migrations can be traced through a genetic variant of the M35-215 branch, known as haplotype 5. Like a genetic fingerprint, this marker appears to have originated in the southern Nile Valley region. It is believed to be connected to early speakers of Proto-Afroasiatic, the ancient mother tongue from which all Afroasiatic languages descended. The absence of words for farming or animal husbandry in the reconstructed Proto-Afroasiatic vocabulary suggests that the Proto-Afroasiatic language was spoken by hunter-gatherers who lived before the advent of agriculture, potentially pushing the language family's age back 15,000 years or more. As populations grew and ventured into new territories, they moved in what scientists call kin-structured migration, where extended families and clans journey together, maintaining both their genetic heritage and their linguistic traditions. Today, we can trace their paths by following the geographic distribution of haplotype 5. Like footprints in the sands of time, this genetic marker appears in a great arc stretching from the Horn of Africa through the regions above the Sahara. The numbers tell a fascinating story. Approximately 55% of populations across Mauritania and North Africa carry this marker, while in Ethiopia, it appears in nearly 46% of the population. Among certain groups, the concentrations are even higher, reaching about 61% in Ethiopian Falasha, also known as Ethiopian Jews, and a remarkable 69% in Moroccan Berbers. These high concentrations likely resulted from what geneticists call the founder effect, when a small group of pioneers established a new population and their genetic signatures become amplified in their descendants. Yet when we look at modern Semitic-speaking populations in the Near East, the Arab and Jewish communities, we find a surprising twist. Despite speaking languages from the Afroasiatic family, these groups show much lower frequencies of haplotype 5, dropping as low as 7% in Iraq. This genetic evidence adds weight to the theory that the Semitic branch represents a more recent offshoot of the ancient Afroasiatic tree, with different genetic influences shaping these populations over time. Another genetic signature, haplotype 8, tells a different tale, one centered in the Near East. This genetic marker appears frequently among indigenous Arabic-speaking and Jewish communities, present in about 45% of the population across the Levant. But its frequency drops dramatically as we move westward, appearing in just 6% of populations across North Africa and Mauritania. Ethiopia, however, presents us with an intriguing puzzle. Here, about 23% of non-Jewish Ethiopians carry haplotype 8, lower than Near Eastern populations, but significantly higher than what we typically find elsewhere in Africa. This unexpected pattern opens a window into ancient connections between continents. Scientists propose two explanations for this genetic bridge between Ethiopia and the Near East. First, we know that Ethiopia maintained extensive trading networks with Arabia throughout history. Second, the relatively high frequency of haplotype 8 in Ethiopia might be the result of genetic drift, a process where, by chance, certain genetic variants become more common in a population over time. But perhaps the most fascinating insight comes from what these genetic patterns tell us about the spread of cultures and religions across ancient populations. Consider the Ethiopian Falasha, who practice Judaism but show high frequencies of haplotype 5, while lacking the haplotype 8 characteristic of Near Eastern populations. This genetic evidence suggests something remarkable. Rather than being descendants of immigrant Jewish communities from the Near East, the Falasha likely adopted Judaism while maintaining their original genetic heritage. It's a powerful reminder that cultures and languages can spread through adoption and adaptation, not just through migration and conquest. We see a similar pattern among North African Arabic speakers. Their high frequencies of haplotype 5 tell us that when Arabic language and culture spread across North Africa, it wasn't primarily through population replacement. Instead, existing North African populations adopted the Arabic language while maintaining their genetic ties to their African ancestors. Scholars believe this pattern of cultural adoption, without population replacement, explains one of the great mysteries of ancient linguistics, the spread of Semitic languages. As the Neolithic Revolution transformed the Near East through the domestication of plants and animals, a small group of African Proto-Afroasiatic speakers ventured into the Levant over 6,000 years ago. Here, their influence endured. Rather than replacing the local populations, they intertwined with local cultures, laying the groundwork for the birth of the Semitic languages. This explains why modern Arabic and Jewish populations in the Middle East carry different genetic markers than African populations while still speaking languages from the Afroasiatic family. It also accounts for the presence of about 7% Ethio-Somali genetic ancestry in all studied Levantine populations. The story continues into more recent times. Around 3,000 years ago, a new chapter began as people from Arabia moved into the Horn of Africa. This migration gave birth to the Ethio-Semitic languages we know today, such as Amharic and Tigrinya, and explains why Semitic speakers in the Horn of Africa carry genetic markers of more recent Arabian ancestry. The vocabulary of these ancient languages provides further evidence of this complex history. When linguists reconstruct Proto-Semitic, the ancestor of all Semitic languages, they find terms for farming, grain cultivation, and animal domestication. This linguistic evidence aligns perfectly with archaeological discoveries in the Levant, where early farming communities known as the Natufians were developing agriculture during the same period. Yet the roots of agricultural practice stretch back even further into our past. Archaeological discoveries have revealed that the Proto-Afroasiatic speakers were not simply hunter-gatherers, but also harvesters of wild grains. Christopher Ehret's reconstruction of the Proto-Afroasiatic vocabulary paints a vivid picture of a people whose lives centered around hunting, gathering, and the extensive collection of wild grasses. This wasn't a brief phase in their development. This economic focus persisted through the early periods of the Afroasiatic language family's evolution, which would have profound implications for the development of later cultures and languages. According to Ehret's research, the Cushitic languages emerged from these early grass collectors in the northern Horn of Africa.
Now, I've proposed elsewhere that the adoption of grain harvesting was very probably a response to the climate changes around the period of the last glacial maximum. This period peaked around the 20th millennium BCE. And widely across Africa at that time, climates became drier, significantly drier. And the results in the Horn would have been the shrinking back of forested areas and the expansion of grassland areas with edible wild grains, especially in the northern Ethiopian highlands and the northern edges of those highlands. Now, there is one particular kind of item that is determinative of this economy, and it's an item that survives well in the archaeology, much better than the grains itself. And that item is a small sickle-shaped stone blade with a particular surface feature, a kind of sheen caused specifically by the repeated cutting off over time of many ears of grain. Most of the period of several years around the glacial maximum, our archaeological knowledge of the farther northern Ethiopian highlands is really minimal because so few sites have been studied. But there is one notable exception, Laga Oda. Laga Oda is located at the northeastern margin of the highlands near the modern-day city of Diridawa. And the findings of Laga Oda fit right in with the predictions of the ancient Afroasiatic word histories. And the occupation at Laga Oda dates back to around 16,000 BCE, calibrated date. Already in its earliest levels, we can find those key diagnostic items, the small blades bearing the sheen, the telltale sheen, shall we call it, of harvesting. The earliest finds at Laga Oda belong to the era immediately preceding the first appearance of the new kind of tool and economy in Egypt. So, in Egypt, this new economic orientation and its determinative tool arrived 1,000 years later, around 15,000 BCE, and these features came as part of the arrival along the Egyptian Nile of a new culture, the Ophian culture. In that very period, between 16,000 and 15,000 BCE, the first amelioration of the extreme dry climate of the glacial maximum began in areas along both sides of the Red Sea, in the form of somewhat increased rainfall to support an expansion of grassland steppe. And for our purposes, grassland steppe right through the chain of hills and middling mountains that connect the northern Horn of Africa and Upper Egypt, the Red Sea Hills as they tend to be called. So in effect, the climatic amelioration opened an environmental pathway in the 16th millennium for the potential spread of the wild grain harvesting economy as far north as Egypt. Now, moving on from that, who might have been the people then that could have taken advantage and moved that economy northward to Egypt? Well, the linguistic maps of the successive earlier periods of Afroasiatic divergence that we briefly looked at, they offer one strong possibility. So let's go back to those maps, and we'll put ourselves at this particular stage of history. And that is the divergence of the Proto-Northeast Eritreic speakers out of the earlier Eritreic community. The geographically most parsimonious spread line would be along the Red Sea Hills. Now, this is not a story of population replacement when we look at the archaeology. In the archaeology, some of the older tool-making techniques of the previous existing Egyptian Nile people of before 15,000 BCE got adopted into the overall Ophian toolkit. It's in part a story of the arrival of new people from farther south in Africa, bringing a new subsistence economy and cultural ideas north to the Egyptian Nile regions. But it's a story, too, of the melding of the immigrants and the existing populations into a new society, with a new language and probably the adoption of new cultural ideas and practices that came along with the immigrants. Now, one caveat, archaeologically, this proposed history fits the current evidence, currently available evidence, but there is one notable gap. We have no archaeology for the crucial millennium in the crucial intervening lands along the Red Sea Hills. But the history I pose at least does raise a testable proposition for future archaeological investigation. It tells us what I am expecting we should find. The evidence of the spread of a wild grain economy in the 16th millennium BCE through the Red Sea Hills.
By the early Holocene between 10,000 and 9,000 BCE, the practice of intensive grass collection spread to Palestine alongside the rise of the Natufian culture. The types of grasses used differed based on what naturally grew in each region. In the Near East, wild barley and wheat were the main grasses people collected. In Nubia, people might have gathered sorghum and barley. In northern Ethiopia, people probably collected teff and finger millet. The timing of this spread coincided with a major climatic event in northern Africa when the summer monsoon moved northward and brought seasonal rains to the Sahara, initiating a period known as the Green Sahara or the African Humid Period. The African Humid Period was driven by changes in the Earth's orbit and axial tilt, which affected the distribution of solar radiation across the planet.
As a result, summer radiation over North Africa was 7% higher than it is today. While this difference may seem small, it had an immense impact on the region's climate. With more energy hitting the surface, air got hotter and rose higher, creating a low-pressure zone and in turn a convection that drew moist air in from the surrounding Atlantic. This moist air then rose and cooled down, condensing into rain clouds that showered over the Sahara. Climate models have revealed that this process increased North African rainfall by between 17 and 50% compared to today. This increased rainfall allowed for more vegetation growth along the coasts and southern edges of the Sahara. And vegetation, which is darker than sand and therefore absorbs more energy, plus helps transfer underground moisture into the atmosphere through transpiration, in turn generated more rainfall. More rainfall allowed for more plant life, creating a positive feedback loop that ultimately spread vegetation across North Africa. Meanwhile, this extra rainfall began accumulating in the region's geographic depressions to form lakes. Some of these were enormous, including Lakes Megathezon and Anet in modern-day Libya and Algeria, and Lake Megachad, which once covered 360,000 square kilometers, making it the largest freshwater lake in the world at the time and slightly smaller than the Caspian Sea today. These lakes, along with now non-existent river networks, trapped water in the Sahara's interior, allowing for vegetation to be sustained year-round. As a result, nearly the entire Sahara Desert was turned into a lush green region, all just 10,000 years ago. And while this may seem hard to believe, there are loads of evidence to support it. All across the Sahara, in places where there is now nothing but sand and rock, art from ancient peoples reveal highly detailed scenes of gazelles, elephants, rhinos, hippos, giraffes, and other animals. In the Tenere Desert in Niger, which is now completely inhospitable to life, archaeologists have found hundreds of human graves and the remains of land animals, large fish, and crocodiles. In Libya and Algeria, ancient riverbeds have been discovered with evidence of human occupation. And in Chad, evidence of Lake Megachad's ancient shores are shown through sandspits and beach ridges. Maybe the most direct evidence, though, comes from sampled cores of underwater sediment off the coast of Africa, which are used to study Saharan dust flux, the amount of sand blown off the African continent and into the ocean. These cores reveal that between 10 and 5,000 years ago, the amount of sand blowing off Africa was much lower than today, which can be linked to more moisture and plant life. In addition, the pollen trapped in these cores reveals increases in plants like grasses and sedges during this time period. Because of all this evidence, scientists have deduced that between 12 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was a completely different region than today, covered in grasslands, waterways, and forests, and filled with animals and ancient human settlements.
As the climate shifted between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, people began to venture into what we now know as the Sahara Desert. But this was not the harsh, forbidding landscape we see today. Recent research has unveiled the existence of what scientists call an ancient green Saharan population who flourished in this region between 12,000 and 5,000 years ago. A 2023 study revealed that approximately 30% of the genetic ancestry of the modern Fulani people can be traced back to this ancient population. The Fulani, who represent the world's largest nomadic pastoral community, are spread across a vast expanse of Africa, from West Africa, through the Sahara and the Sahel, reaching all the way to the Red Sea coast in Sudan. They speak Fula, a language belonging to the Senegambian branch of the Niger-Congo family. Yet, there are mysteries in this ancient landscape that may never be fully solved. Linguist Roger Blench suggests that before the spread of Berber and Arabic languages across North Africa, the region echoed with the sounds of now-vanished tongues. The ancient North African foragers, who left their marks in archaeological remains and genetic signatures, likely spoke languages that have completely disappeared from human memory. Though scholars have traditionally referred to these lost languages as Paleo-Berber, Blench argues this term makes unfounded assumptions about their relationship to modern Berber languages. Instead, he proposes the more neutral term, Old North African, acknowledging these languages as distinct entities without presuming their linguistic connections. In a fascinating hypothesis, he suggests these forgotten tongues might have shared connections with ancient languages of the Iberian Peninsula, such as Tartessian, hinting at cultural connections across the Mediterranean that predate our current linguistic landscape. From an archaeological perspective, Blench associates these Old North African languages with the Capsian culture and its predecessors, as well as with the early Neolithic period in the Maghreb. Physical evidence adds another fascinating dimension to this story of ancient diversity. A 1950 study examined 3 skulls from the Capsian period in the Maghreb, revealing a remarkable story of population mixing. The anatomical features told a complex tale of human movement and interaction. The dominant characteristics aligned with Mediterranean populations who had arrived from the eastern lands, while other traits aligned with both Iberomaurusian cultures, who had long inhabited the region, and populations from sub-Saharan Africa. These findings suggest that the Capsian people were themselves a testament to human mobility and interaction, their very features reflecting a confluence of different populations coming together to create new communities and cultures. But what role did climate play in shaping these ancient connections? A groundbreaking genetic study has shed new light on this question by examining Y chromosome markers in approximately 8,000 males across African, Eurasian, and African American populations. The results paint a vivid picture of how the Green Sahara period transformed human movement across the continent, allowing people to travel freely between northern and sub-Saharan Africa. Scientists initially hypothesized that sub-Saharan genetic patterns in North Africa primarily came from the medieval Arab slave trade. To test this, they compared genetic patterns between 3 groups: African Americans, North Africans, and sub-Saharan Africans. The logic was straightforward. If slave trades were the primary source of sub-Saharan ancestry, both African Americans and North Africans should show similar genetic patterns, as both groups received people from similar regions through their respective slave trade. The results challenged this hypothesis. African Americans showed clear genetic links to sub-Saharan populations, but North Africans displayed distinctly different patterns. The origins of North Africa's sub-Saharan genetic components were much older, likely dating back to the Green Sahara period when the region was habitable and supported human migration. This created a puzzle. Previous genome-wide studies had found evidence of recent sub-Saharan genetic influence in North Africa, which they attributed to the Arab slave trade. How could we reconcile these seemingly contradictory findings? The key lay in examining different types of DNA separately. When researchers analyzed maternal and paternal DNA patterns independently, a more nuanced picture emerged. The maternal and autosomal DNA in North African populations show recent sub-Saharan connections, while their paternal ancestry come from much earlier times. This pattern emerged from a crucial difference between the Arab and Atlantic slave trade. The Arab slave trade brought approximately twice as many women as men to North Africa. These women, working as servants and concubines, had children who were considered free citizens, allowing their genetic patterns to become established in the population. Male slaves had fewer opportunities to have children, so they left less genetic impact. The researchers found 4 specific male genetic lineages dating to the Green Sahara period. The initial occupation of the Sahara likely occurred from both the north and the south as the region became more fertile. 2 of these genetic lineages, A3M13 and EM2, show patterns of people moving northward from southern regions, while the other 2, M78 and RV88, show movement from north to south. This matches what archaeologists have found about human settlements in the region. The earliest evidence of these migrations comes from about 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, when populations carrying the EM78 lineage, a branch of the EM215 lineage, spread from the Eastern Sahara across East Africa and the Mediterranean. Many of them are areas where Afroasiatic languages are spoken today. Another group in East Africa, carrying a genetic marker belonging to Haplogroup A, called A3M13, spread across North Africa, the Middle East, and Sardinia around 10,750 years ago. According to the research, it may once have had a broader presence across southern Europe before being replaced by different Y chromosome lineages that arrived through successive waves of migration from Asia. Today, this lineage is strongly associated with Nilo-Saharan-speaking populations, particularly among Nilotic pastoralists. Around 10,500 years ago, populations carrying the EM2 lineage underwent a significant expansion into the Sahara. The research uncovered 11 new subbranches of EM2 that weren't seen in previous large-scale studies, some of which include samples from northern Africa. They discovered that the shared ancestor of EM2 lineages, found in both northern and sub-Saharan Africa, lived between 11,000 and 4,500 years ago. After the Green Sahara period ended, new branches of EM2 tended to stay either north or south of the Sahara, with little mixing between the two regions. A genetic analysis of Pharaoh Ramesses III and his son Peneweret revealed that both mummies were found to carry the Y chromosome haplogroup EM2. The presence of this EM2 haplogroup in these ancient Egyptian royals is significant, as it provides evidence of genetic connections between ancient Egyptians and sub-Saharan African populations. This finding contributes to our understanding of the genetic diversity and population movements in ancient Egypt. Haplogroup RV88 shows a particularly strong presence among Chadic-speaking populations in the central Sahel. It is also found at lower frequencies in North Africa among Afroasiatic speakers, with a notably high frequency among Berbers from the Siwa Oasis in Egypt. It represents a migration back from Asia to Africa between 9,200 to 5,600 years ago. This timing aligns with a theory proposed by Christopher Ehret that around 7,000 years ago, Proto-Chadic Afroasiatic speakers moved westward through the central Sahara and then southward into the Lake Chad Basin. Another hypothesis developed by Roger Blench, called the Inter-Saharan hypothesis, proposes that Chadic-speaking pastoralists left their original homeland in the Nile Valley and traveled along the now dried-up Wadi Howar, an ancient riverbed system that flowed eastward from the highlands of Darfur toward the Nile around 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. Blench's theory is also supported by DNA evidence. A mitochondrial DNA marker called L3F3, which emerged around 8,000 years ago, is found almost exclusively among Chadic speakers in the Chad Basin. Its origins trace back to East Africa, aligning with the linguistic theory of an Eastern origin for these language groups. This suggests that at some point, a group of people moved from East Africa to the Chad Basin, bringing this genetic marker with them. These contrasting genetic patterns show different population movements may have occurred, though the nature and timing of these movements would require additional research to confirm. Wadi Howar was vital to early human communities, providing resources for fishing, grazing, and cultivating wild grains. Archaeologists found special pottery decorated with dotted wavy line patterns dating to around 6,000 BCE. These artifacts have been found throughout Northeast and North Africa, in regions where Afroasiatic languages are currently spoken. The river didn't just sustain local populations, it connected them. Acting as a natural corridor, Wadi Howar linked Central Africa to the Nile Valley, facilitating the movement of people, goods, and ideas. This connection allowed for trade, innovation, and cultural exchange, making the region a hub of activity in an otherwise challenging environment. By 4000 BCE, the Wadi Howar region witnessed cultural transitions. New decorative pottery styles emerged, including the distinctive lighter band motif, a pattern of ladder-like impressions. These changes reflect evolving lifestyles, as communities began to incorporate early forms of agriculture and pastoralism into their way of life. Archaeological evidence shows that Nilo-Saharan pastoralists migrated eastward along Wadi Howar, bringing with them the lighter band pottery. They encountered hunter-gatherer and fishing communities in the Wadi Howar area, which produced the distinctive wavy line artifacts. DNA of both ancient remains and modern populations have revealed that significant contact and genetic mixing had occurred between the Nilo-Saharan pastoralist migrants and the more settled hunter-gatherer communities. Some linguists propose that the spread of Eastern Sudanic languages originated from an ancient population in the Wadi Howar Valley. Linguistic analysis reveals similarities between Eastern Sudanic languages, which can be traced back to a common Proto-Eastern Sudanic ancestor. Many of these northeastern Nilo-Saharan languages, including Nubian, picked up several constructs from their contact with Cushitic and Omotic languages in Wadi Howar. There are also similarities in the words for domesticated animals between Cushitic and Chadic languages, pointing to a common origin and shared history of animal husbandry. Yet perhaps one of the most significant challenges to traditional narratives comes from recent studies of African cattle. While conventional wisdom long held that pastoralism arrived in Africa, with the migration of people carrying the RV88 genetic marker, new evidence tells a different story, one of indigenous African innovation and adaptation. Wild cattle once roamed a vast territory stretching from the Near East down to the Sudan belt. This wide distribution suggests an intriguing possibility that cattle domestication might have occurred independently in northern or northeastern Africa, with ancient Kushite and Nilo-Saharan speakers playing a crucial role in this process. A comprehensive study of African cattle DNA has provided compelling evidence for this theory. Examining 50 cattle populations across 23 African countries, researchers discovered something remarkable. The DNA of both Taurine and Zebu cattle carried a unique genetic signature, one distinctly African, predating any influence from European, Near Eastern, or Asian cattle breeds. This discovery turns traditional assumptions on their head. While there is evidence of later genetic contributions from European and Near Eastern cattle in certain regions, these appear to be secondary additions to an already established African cattle lineage. The highest genetic diversity among African cattle was found in the Eastern Sahara, with diversity gradually decreasing the farther one moves from this region. This pattern suggests that cattle populations originated in the Eastern Sahara and gradually spread to other parts of Africa. Christopher Ehret reconstructed the earliest cattle-related cognates to Nilo-Saharan groups in the Eastern Sahara. It begins with the Proto-Northern Sudanic branch, developing vocabulary for cattle raising, followed by the Proto-Saharo-Sahelian sub-branch of Northern Sudanic, expanding the vocabulary to include words for cultivation and complex homesteads, with cattle pens, roundhouses, and granaries, suggesting a shift towards more settled agricultural practices. The Proto-Saharo-Sahelian language eventually splits into two branches, Proto-Saharan and Proto-Sahelian. As these two language groups emerged, we see an important addition to their vocabularies. Specifically, they developed new words related to the breeding of goats and sheep, indicating a further diversification of their animal husbandry practices. Archaeological findings in the northern parts of eastern Sudan, now part of the southeastern Sahara, shows three remarkably similar distinct phases of development. The first phase, dated between 8500 and 7500 BCE, shows the emergence of nomadic cattle herders. The second phase, beginning before 7200 BCE, is marked by the appearance of round houses, granaries, and other signs of large, semi-permanent settlements. The third phase, occurring in the 6000s BCE, sees the introduction of sheep and goats from the Levant. The Afad Basin in northern Sudan offers another unique glimpse into the history of cattle in northeastern Africa. This region has gained significant attention from archaeologists due to its rich prehistoric remains, including well-preserved remnants of prehistoric camps and diverse hunting and gathering sites that date back approximately 50,000 years. One site provides evidence of ancient wild cattle, known as aurochs, that roamed the landscape 50,000 years ago, and their later domesticated descendants of 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. The story of these early pastoralists takes an even more fascinating turn. DNA evidence shows a simultaneous expansion of different lineages of Nilo-Saharan and Afroasiatic pastoralists between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago. What triggered this coordinated movement? Scientists believe it may have been a clever adaptation to changing climate conditions. A brief arid period forced these groups to develop new pastoral resources, and when wetter conditions returned, they were perfectly positioned to expand across the rejuvenated landscape. These expanding populations followed different paths, each carving out their own territories across the vast African landscape. The Saharan pastoralists made their home around the Taseti Mountains, while speakers of the Sahelian branch moved westward through the Lake Mega-Chad region, eventually reaching the Great Bend of the Niger River. Meanwhile, the Eastern Sudanic speakers spread through the Middle Nile Basin, their territory stretching from the confluence of the White and Blue Nile rivers up to just north of Aswan. These people would become the ancestors of the Nubians and Nilotic peoples. But perhaps most intriguingly, another group would settle in the region stretching from just north of Aswan to El Badari in Middle Egypt. These people, speaking dialects that would eventually evolve into the ancient Egyptian language, would lay the foundation for one of history's most remarkable civilizations. DNA evidence reveals that these ancient Egyptians shared close genetic ties with their southern neighbors, showing clear biological connections to Nubian and other African populations. The transition from gathering wild grasses to cultivation marks another fascinating chapter in this story. Unlike a single revolutionary moment, this shift occurred independently across different regions at different times. In some areas, people were already tending their herds before they began cultivating grains. In others, the cultivation of grasses happened alongside the domestication of animals. Each community adapted to their unique environment in their own way. The Near East saw the domestication of barley and wheat, alongside cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, during the 8th or late 9th millennium BCE. Donkeys, which were native to northeast Africa, were probably first domesticated in Africa. In Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, people began cultivating indigenous crops like teff and inset thousands of years before Christ, possibly as early as their Near Eastern counterparts. The use of wheat and barley may have also existed several thousand years before any South Arabian influence. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests the region may have also given rise to a remarkable innovation, the mersha, a single-handled Ethiopian scratch plow. Different from the two-handled Egyptian plow, this tool may be one of Africa's oldest plows, first used by Cushitic-speaking peoples of Nubia, long before any Arabian influence reached the region. The story of agricultural development in ancient Egypt presents us with an intriguing puzzle. At sites like Fayum, Merimd, and El Badari, early communities gradually incorporated Near Eastern domesticates into their existing foraging practices. But here's what's fascinating. The ancient Egyptian words for these Near Eastern crops aren't borrowed from Sumerian or Proto-Semitic languages, as we might expect if they were introduced by migrants. This linguistic evidence suggests a more complex story than simple population replacement or dominant migration. Some scholars believe these ancient Egyptians were essentially the same population group as Nubians and other Saharan populations during this prehistoric period, with some genetic input from the Levant and North Africa. A similar pattern is observed west of Egypt, where the pre-existing Capsian culture gradually adopted domestic animals and later grains starting around 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. Further south, in what is now Sudan and nearby areas that are now in the Sahara Desert, plant domestication was well established by the 4th millennium BCE. We know this because Sudanese crops had already reached as far as India by the 3rd millennium BCE. Additionally, the Kadero site, dating to the late 5th millennium, reveals a well-developed mixed agriculture, hinting at even earlier origins possibly extending back to the 6th millennium BCE. Between 6000 and 3000 BCE, something remarkable happened. A common economic culture, with a common set of cultural ideas and ritual practices, emerged along the Nile Valley, stretching from hundreds of kilometers south of where the Blue and White Nile meet, all the way north to El Badari in Middle Egypt. According to Christopher Ehret, many cultural innovations, from burial practices to ceramic styles and other innovations, often originated in the southern Nilo-Saharan speaking areas before spreading northward to Egypt.
Now, the story of ancient Egypt, Nubia, and Sudan in the period around 6,000 to 3,000 BCE. Now, to tell this story, I want to introduce a particular anthropological concept, the concept of a culture area. Anthropologists, as they built their discipline in the 19th century, encountered regions in more than one part of the world in which people of different historical origins had for centuries been involved in extensive cross-cultural interactions with each other. And because of those long histories of cultural interchange, the societies of those regions, despite having maybe disparate earlier origins, despite speaking different languages of different families, often came to share many features of culture with each other. Their lands formed a culture area, an interactive region of long-term cultural interchange and even cultural convergence. Upper Egypt and the Eastern Sudan belt formed just such a zone of extensive cross-cultural influences from the late 7th millennium BCE on into later millennia. This view has now become common understanding among the cohort or cohorts of archaeologists who have contributed so greatly over the past 3 decades to widening and deepening our knowledge of those regions and those times. So in a recent article in the major journal Antiquity. David Wengrow and his co-authors bring these findings together. Their title is a telling one: Cultural Convergence in the Neolithic of the Nile Valley, a prehistoric perspective on Egypt's place in Africa. What they describe taking place is the emergence from around 6000 BCE onward across that whole expanse, from a few hundred kilometers south of the Blue and White Nile confluence to as far north as El Badari in Middle Egypt, of a common economic culture, and they call it a primary pastoral economy. But they then go on to show that the cultural commonalities across these regions went far deeper than that. And the economy, by the way, was not completely pastoral. This is partly the bias of what you get to discover in the archaeology. But even little bits of the archaeological evidence, and certainly the linguistic evidence, indicate the cultivating and harvesting of grains, and certainly on the Sudan side of things, of other crops as well. Crops we've talked about yesterday, like melons and so on. Now, from south of the Blue Nile, White and Blue Nile confluence to around just a bit north of the latitude of Aswan, it appears from the differences we can detect that the participants in this history of culture interaction would have spoken languages of what's called the Eastern Sudanic or the Eastern Sahelian branch of the Nilo-Saharan language family, a different language family, with its origins in the area of what modern-day Sudan and South Sudan. From a little north of Aswan to El Badari in Middle Egypt, they would have spoken, it appears, dialects of the language that was to evolve into ancient Egyptian. Now, before we go on any further, there's something else very important for us to understand. I've kind of mentioned it previously, but we need to understand the geographical setting. For this historical period, forget the idea of ancient Egypt as a gift of the Nile. In the formative age, from even before 6000 BCE down to around the 3300s, the river was just another locale of settlement within a far vaster region of human habitation. In that 3,000-year period, an environment, and a bit from before then as well, an environment of continuous steppe grassland predominated across middle and southern Egypt, as well as far south into the Sudan. Some communities most certainly did live close to the Nile, and the locations of any early large villages probably would have tended to be along the river. But the great majority of the inhabitants of the Middle Nile culture area would not have lived along the river. They would have carried out their lives instead and their pastoral economies in the wide expanse of lands extending for some hundreds of kilometers, extending both sides east and west of the river. As the archaeology of these lands reveals, these people shared much more than a common economy. They also they also participated, to use Wengrow et al.'s expression, they participated in a long-term history of cultural convergence, as we said, with a common set of cultural ideas and ritual practices taking hold from south of the confluence to the founding regions of ancient Egypt. Along the Nile, and here's where this slide becomes relevant, as well as in the surrounding steppe grasslands, from south of the confluence to El Badari. Again, to quote Wengrow and his co-authors, treatments of the dead became remarkably uniform. Burials followed, quote unquote, a common ritual template. And they did so whether the local population spoke a Nilo-Saharan language or an ancestral form of the ancient Egyptian language. And there's a second key historical point to make here. More often than not, it appears that new features of culture, new notable features, tended to have their origins in the more southerly areas, among people who would have spoken not early ancient Egyptian, but languages of the Nilo-Saharan family. Now, if you look back at your list of grave goods, mace heads, for example, appear first in burials in the Sudan. In the 6th millennium, it's by the 4th millennium that they finally become common in Upper and Middle Egypt. And for your fun, here's a couple of mace heads of rather famous ones. late 4th millennium kings who were involved in the lead-up developments to the consolidation of Old Kingdom Egypt. The one on the left can be connected with the king known as Scorpion. The one on the right is for Narmer, who is either, in some people's view, the founding king or the king just before the founding king of the Old Kingdom. So a couple of nice little cases here. Now, similarly, prominent ceramic styles evolved out of styles initiated farther south. To use the term of the eminent French archaeologist, Béatrice Midonrain, the ceramics all across the region in the 5th and 4th millennia were foreshadowed in later 6th millennium ceramics and early 5th in the Nile confluence region of the Sudan. So in witness of that, here are a few striking ceramic images. It's always fun. Now these are really dark black burnished pots, but because it's an old photograph from 50 or 70 years ago anyway, and black and white, and I took it straight out of the book instead of having a first-hand copy, you don't see the real blackness. But here we can take ourselves way north from Shahinab, way down in Sudan, which you can see on your map, way up to the other end to El Badari in the later 5th millennium. And you can see also the development that starts taking place by this period of red as well as black burnished ware. So you get this combination of things. And here, 4th millennium pots, Lower Nubia, that means sort of northern Nubia, south of Egypt, Nilo-Saharan speaking areas. And here's also from Lower Nubia. I want to point out on this one in particular, the rippling, which as far as we can see, actually begins south of Egypt and then spreads as a decorative motif northward. So here's with rippling in Qustul and onward with some early things and even taking us on to Kerma in the 3rd millennium. We also have lexical evidence, linguistic evidence, and not surprisingly, at least one of these bits of lexical evidence evokes something about the shared ceramic technology. And then other word histories reveal Southern influences, not just in primary pastoral economy, which you can see in some words there like the cattle pen term. So at the same time, there were crops spreading north, not just south from the Levant into Egypt, but northward from the Sudan. And so you see there the watermelon term, but there are other ones, muskmelons and bottle gourds and such moving northward.
Another compelling set of archaeological evidence lies in the heart of Egypt's western desert at Nabta Playa. Nabta Playa, discovered by archaeologist Fred Wendorf, stands as one of humanity's earliest ventures into complex astronomical observation and social organization, 3,000 years earlier than Stonehenge. It is located 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel and roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Aswan. Today, the site appears as little more than a sun-scorched basin in an unforgiving desert. But between 9,000 and 3,500 BCE, this landscape told a different story. The summer monsoon rains of the Holocene transformed the barren expanse into a life-sustaining oasis. The waters that collected in its internally draining basin created seasonal lakes, drawing both wildlife and human settlers to its shores. In the 9th and 8th millennia BCE, small groups of nomadic peoples established seasonal camps along the basin's edge. These early settlers left behind traces of their presence such as hearths, tools, and the bones of animals that sustained them. Fred Wendorf, the site's discoverer, and Christopher Ehret have suggested that the inhabitants may have been early pastoralists or practiced semi-pastoralism. Others point to evidence that the cattle remains found at the site were from wild, not domesticated animals. As the millennia passed, these temporary camps began to evolve. By the 7th millennium BCE, the inhabitants of Nabta Playa had begun to master their environment. They dug deep wells to access water year-round and constructed permanent dwellings arranged in straight rows. They produced some of the earliest pottery known in the Saharan region, which was similar to the Archenean culture of Lower Nubia, indicating that early Holocene settlers likely came from the Nile Valley. By the 5th millennium BCE, the settlement transformed into a complex ceremonial center, marked by one of the most remarkable achievements of its time, a sophisticated array of megalithic structures aligned with the stars. These ancient astronomers created three primary megalithic alignments, two tracking the heliacal rising points of Sirius and Orion's belt, while a third longer array pointed toward the eternal stars of the Big Dipper in the northern sky. This was no mere coincidence. The rising of Sirius coincided with the life-giving monsoon season, allowing them to predict and prepare for the annual floods. In what archaeologists now call the Valley of Sacrifices, 10 tumuli stand as testament to the spiritual life of Nabta Playa's inhabitants. These carefully constructed monuments of sandstone blocks contain sacrificial offerings of cattle, goats, and sheep. The largest, dating to 5270 BCE, held an entire cow oriented from north to south. Perhaps most striking among the discoveries was a massive sandstone boulder, weighing up to 3 tons, meticulously shaped to resemble a cow, an early expression of what would become a powerful religious symbol. The construction of megalithic monuments and elaborate burial grounds indicates a level of political concentration sufficient to mobilize a large labor force by the 5th millennium BCE, perhaps even the emergence of a small state or centralized chiefdom, long before such systems appeared elsewhere in Egypt. The precision and complexity of the astronomical alignments point to something even more intriguing: the presence of a formal priesthood, a class of specialists who dedicated themselves to studying the heavens and conducting sacred rituals that bound the community together. The people who created these wonders were primarily of sub-Saharan African origin. Their language, scholars suggest, may have been Nilo-Saharan. They cultivated a varied diet of wild plants, including legumes, millets, sorghum, tubers, and fruits, and eventually incorporated domesticated goats and sheep from Western Asia into their herds. Nabta Playa predated Egyptian civilization by more than 1,000 years, and likely served as a crucible for ideas that would later influence Egyptian culture and religion. The astronomical knowledge demonstrated in its megalithic alignments echoes in later Egyptian temple architecture. The cattle cult that emerged foreshadowed Egyptian religious practices, particularly the worship of the celestial goddess Hathor. The site's careful attention to stellar movements and its connection to the eternal stars of the northern sky foreshadowed Egyptian concepts of life, death, and resurrection. The cultural foundations of Egypt were deeply intertwined with those of its southern neighbors in Nubia and Sudan. Along the banks of the ancient Nile, a fascinating story of cultural exchange and political power unfolded between Egypt and its southern neighbors. In the Nilo-Saharan-speaking territories, the A group culture flourished from around 3800 to 2900 BCE, a period that coincided with Egypt's Naqada period and early dynastic era. Their territory primarily encompassed Lower Nubia, the region between the first and second cataracts of the Nile, in what is now southern Egypt and northern Sudan. The Egyptians knew this region as Taseti, or the Land of the Bow, a name that paid homage to the legendary archery skills of its inhabitants. By 3600 BCE, the A group culture had developed into a sophisticated trading society, establishing strong commercial ties with Egypt. Their merchants traded precious commodities like gold and ivory in exchange for Egyptian goods. The civilization reached its zenith between 3400 and 2900 BCE, with its power centered near Qustul. The rich burial sites discovered in this region reveal a highly stratified society led by powerful rulers, painting a picture of a complex civilization that may have been the equal of its northern neighbor during this formative period of human history. The kingdom of Qustul, situated just south of Egypt's borders in what is now Nubia and Sudan, emerged as a significant force during the 4th millennium BCE, influencing Egypt both culturally and politically. According to Erit, the Qustul state exerted dominance over a vast region, encompassing territories and communities along the Nile and beyond, with its elite participating alongside Naqada culture communities in southern Egypt in shaping emerging pharaonic culture. Studies have shown that elite Egyptians shared closer biological similarities with wealthy members of the Nubian A group culture than they did with other Egyptians. Excavations at Qustul cemeteries have revealed significant findings from the A group culture, which contained wealthy burials of Nubian rulers. These Nubian rulers utilized similar royal symbols as early Egyptian pharaohs. One of the most fascinating discoveries from these cemeteries is the incense burners depicting pharaonic imagery, including the white crown of Upper Egypt. The evidence from Qustul, including royal iconography and ritual practices, suggests that Nubia played a significant role in the development of early Egyptian kingship and statehood. But around 3000 BCE, everything changed. The Sahara, once a vast expanse of steppe grassland, began a rapid transformation into the desert we know today. This climatic collapse would reshape the human geography of Africa for millennia. The process of desertification created different patterns of human movement across the continent. In the east, the change was abrupt, creating a sharp genetic divide between North African and Horn of Africa populations. The Central Sahara told a different story. Here, rivers and lakes persisted longer, allowing continued genetic mixing between North and Sub-Saharan African populations until about 4,500 years ago. As the climate shifted, pastoralists moved southward into West Africa and through Ethiopia into East Africa all the way to the grasslands of southern Kenya and Tanzania. The massive paleolake known as Mega-Chad, of which today's Lake Chad is but a tiny remnant, provided a refuge for ancestral Chadic speakers who moved southwest from the Nile region. Meanwhile, around 4,200 years ago, the dramatic climate changes forced some Nilo-Saharan speaking groups to migrate south toward the White Nile. These people, the ancestors of today's Nilotic, Surmic, and Berta peoples, encountered new language communities as they moved southward.
So an immediate demographic consequence appears to have been that the pastoralists out in the emerging desert resettled among the communities along the Nile itself. With this climate collapse, the Nile finally became what we only too often and wrongly assume it to always have been, this narrow corridor of reliably habitable land with a reliable water supply located in the midst of a vast, extremely dry desert. The Nabta Playa site was abandoned. The Qustul kingdom, with the loss of its outlying population, sharply declined in wealth and power between 3300 and 3100 BCE. But in Upper Egypt, the movement of people to the river, I would argue at least, helped to set off an opposite trend. With vastly more arable land in long, continuous stretches, in Lower Nubia at least, the patches of arable land are separated by rocky patches of river. And they're narrow and small. But Egypt, long stretch right off northward up the Nile, down the Nile. So with vastly more arable land, and with a continuous run of such land, different rulers in Upper Egypt could come to rule over territories with much greater populations than could be sustained any longer south of Aswan, at least until you got up to Upper Nubia. And among other things, they would now be able to field larger armies because they had more people to draw on. Now, along with this great and abrupt demographic shift, and I suspect that it was very possibly set in motion indeed by the social and political disruptions of the demographic change, a succession of new developments of lasting historical significance took shape in the last 3 centuries BCE. The emergence of one or more large polities in the regions of the Naqada culture in Upper Egypt, the invention of writing, and finally, by around 3100 BCE and the 31st century BCE, the conquest and establishment of the Old Kingdom, unifying all the Nile regions from Aswan to the Delta. And also one of the things that happened here during that period in the 31st century, there was a major raid southward that under Hor, which apparently was meant to depopulate the people that were there, because apparently they considered the Qustul region to be an area of potential danger. And so we see a real cutting down of the population. They seem to have driven people out and deliberately made sure that that land wasn't going to be a threat in the future. Now, even then, the Old Kingdom continued to have cultural things that showed the wider connection to the Middle Nile cultural world. And one kind of indication, of course, were the celestial ideas and imageries. In addition, it appears that a notable ritual practice, with its origins farther south, played a role in early royal observances of the Old Kingdom. During the first dynasty of Old Kingdom Egypt, royal tombs at Abydos, it now appears, contained not just the graves of the rulers themselves, but also the graves of a large number adjacent graves, a large number of high status individuals buried next to the king, apparently to accompany and look after him in the afterlife. As many as 300 people in the case of the second king, even 135 subsidiary graves in the case of the fifth ruler. So some things to be learned there and maybe tried to be better understood. Now, this ritual treatment of the king's death was similarly practiced early in Nubia, and it was a ritual feature present still in the high age of the Kerma kingdom of Upper Nubia in the second millennium BCE. And more than that, this is a ritual practice that historians have encountered in the history of a number of later Nilo-Saharan speaking or Nilo-Saharan influenced kingdoms in the Sudan belt of Africa, from pre-Christian Nubia to as far west and as late as the empire of the Ghana around the 8th or 9th, maybe as late as the 10th century CE, AD. So now Egypt in this light is best understood not as the source of the practice, but as a portion of the Middle Nile culture area that may for a time have had this custom, but not as deeply rooted maybe in local culture. It dropped back out of use. By the way, of course, we don't know that people were executed to go into the afterlife. They may each, as they've died, in their turn been buried. So we're not prejudging just how this happened.
The transformation of Egyptian society from scattered agricultural communities along the Nile to a unified state represents a crucial turning point in human history. Before unification, Egypt existed as two distinct regions: Lower Egypt, characterized by the Madibuto culture in the north, and Upper Egypt, home to the Naqada culture in the south. Each region developed its own political, social, and material culture. Traditional narratives often paint the unification of Egypt as a story of conquest, a southern victory immortalized in the famous Narmer palette discovered at Hierakonpolis. This remarkable artifact shows Narmer, also known as Menes, wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, seemingly documenting the moment of unification around 3000 BCE. Yet archaeological evidence suggests a more complex story. The process of unification had begun before Narmer, though he completed it through the conquest of a polity in the northwestern delta. But how did this unification actually occur? Despite the limitations of archaeological evidence, most of which comes from Upper Egyptian cemeteries and grave goods, researchers have developed two intriguing theories. The assimilation model challenges the traditional view of Naqadization, which suggested that unification happened through southern conquest and migration that changed the genetic makeup of the population. Instead, it proposes that Lower Egypt voluntarily adopted Naqadan cultural practices through regular contact, without requiring mass migrations or conquest. Even more intriguing is the interactionist model, which suggests an even closer relationship between North and South. This theory views the two regions not as separate cultures, but as regional variations of a single cultural tradition, their similarities stemming from long-standing socioeconomic relationships. Both archaeological and biological evidence from pre-dynastic groups support these more nuanced views of Egyptian unification. This understanding transforms our view of early Egyptian civilization. Rather than seeing it as the product of conquest and population replacement, we can now envision it as the result of gradual cultural exchange and adaptation. It's a reminder that even the most monumental political achievements often grow from centuries of interaction, trade, and mutual influence between neighboring peoples. A recent genetic study of Egyptian mummies suggested significant early contact with the Near East during this formative period. However, the researchers note that these results should be interpreted cautiously since they are based on only 151 individuals from a single site, making broad generalizations about the entire Egyptian population premature. In 2005, researcher Soy Keita proposed a revolutionary idea that would challenge our understanding of human settlement in the Nile Valley. The question was profound yet simple. Were the biological similarities between Nubians and Egyptians merely the result of recent history, or did they stretch back to the very first human settlements in the Nile Valley during the late Pleistocene and mid-Holocene periods? To unlock this mystery, scientists embarked on an ambitious journey through time, examining the skulls of nearly 2,000 individuals from 18 different Nubian and Egyptian populations. Their investigations span millennia, from the late Paleolithic to the Christian era. Perhaps most revealing was the study of the Mesolithic population from Wadi Howar, some of the earliest known inhabitants of the Nile Valley. These ancient people provide crucial insights into how the region was first populated. The Mesolithic group showed remarkably close biological similarities with later Nubian A group and C group samples from the same Wadi Howar region. They also showed closer biological similarities to the Egyptian Nabta population than to other Nubian groups like the ones from Cultivation Island. What's more, they displayed similar levels of genetic variation as other groups, suggesting something profound, that the genetic legacy of the Nile Valley's founding population had been established even before the Mesolithic period. This early genetic foundation wasn't lost over time, but was preserved within Nubian populations, and then shared with Egyptian populations through interaction and mixing over time. Later interactions, such as during the Middle Kingdom period, led to more similarities developing between the populations. The key link was geography. Populations that were closer together showed greater biological similarities, regardless of whether they were classified as Egyptian or Nubian. This pattern created a natural north-south gradient of biological characteristics along the Nile Valley. The lower Nubian samples from Wadi Howar, Sayala C group, Hiza, and Baiga clustered together with Upper Egyptian Coptic, Badarian, and Nakadan samples. Lower Egypt populations in Gizeh, Cairo, and Lisht formed their own distinct group. Some populations had close biological connections that crossed these geographic boundaries. These populations showed greater internal variation, suggesting they experienced more genetic input from outside their region. For example, the Nubian population of Kerma, despite being geographically in Lower Nubia, showed closer biological connections to Lower Egyptian populations in Gizeh and Lisht, closer than even other Egyptian populations in the study. Kerma was an important trade center along the Nile and part of the Kingdom of Kush. They had ongoing contact with Egyptians through trade and military interactions, during periods when Egyptian power in Lower Nubia fluctuated under Kushite control. This interaction continued over many centuries through later periods, including the Meroitic period, when Meroe became another major trade center, and the Napatan period, when peaceful interactions were documented at Tombos, lasting until the Coptic period. The study also found that the Nubian population from Hiza and Baiga showed closer biological similarities to the Egyptian populations of Badari and Nakata than they did to the Nubian population of Kerma. The islands of Hiza and Baiga were located near Philae in Upper Egypt. This area was important as a religious center, with a temple of Isis that remained a pagan worship site during the Christian period until about 551 CE. Baiga also had a temple, and Hiza contained cemeteries where Ptolemaic priests of Isis were buried. The researchers suggest that the presence of these religious monuments and cemeteries would have created opportunities for contact and genetic mixing between populations in this region. The genetic continuity observed in these samples tells us something crucial about population dynamics in ancient Northeast Africa, that the founding population's genetic signature wasn't just preserved within the Nubian population, but it also influenced Egyptian populations through a complex network of genetic exchange and continuity that persisted over thousands of years, rather than a series of complete population replacements. The data points to a scenario where the initial genetic foundation of the Nile Valley was laid down very early in human settlement of the Mesolithic, in Wadi Howar, and this genetic legacy was maintained and transmitted through subsequent periods of cultural change and development. The story of ancient Northeast Africa thus comes full circle, from the early adaptations to changing climate, through the development of agriculture and pastoralism, to the emergence of complex political organizations. We see a pattern of gradual development punctuated by moments of dramatic change from which emerged deep roots of cultural interaction and adaptation, a testament to humanity's capacity for both innovation and integration. This is the legacy of ancient Africa, a story not just of adaptation to changing conditions, but of transformation and renewal. It shows us how human ingenuity, combined with the pressures of environmental change, can give birth to new forms of social organization and cultural achievement.